Hello, friends of Super Luchas. Starting a new project, the podcast of Super Luchas. I'm your friend and host, Milton Eloir. More than an interview, more than a dialogue, it's a chat among friends, and what better way than with the director of Super Luchas magazine, Ernesto Ocampo. How are we doing, Ernesto?
Hello, Milton. How's
Good afternoon, as always, and this podcast for the third time. That's an anecdote we'll tell you later when we've survived. Are we going to talk today among the topics to discuss and with you about the evolution of communication, via coverage of Lucha Libre, Mexican wrestling, how the wrestling content has been distributed from its early days here in Mexico to current times? And why do we talk about this topic so much? For two reasons. One, our friend Ernesto Ocampo, with his great expertise in wrestling, is a historian and has therefore dedicated his life to investigating and trying to analyze this a bit. And the other, because both of us are fascinated by communication. My dear Ernesto, on the topic of how communication has evolved, if you want, we can go quickly by blocks. How did the topic of communication in wrestling start in Mexico? Because some of us can mention that the beginning of Lucha Libre is the beginning of the Empresa Mexicana de Lucha Libre. As you have commented in some other appearances in Super Luchas, it dates back much further. But how did it start to develop, and what was communication like in the early part of Lucha Libre in Mexico?
I think the first thing to understand is that professional wrestling is above all theatrical art. It has a lot to do with the way the press always handled both theater and public entertainments. There was a kind of aesthetic disdain from the elite towards sports and theatrical genres. We could compare wrestling not as the minor genre nor the lowest genre, but as something even lesser. If we go back to the 19th century, there was no press coverage of bullfights. There was no coverage of wrestling. There were few wrestling events in theaters, but almost nothing is known about them, precisely because the press was dedicated to covering the grand genre theater and opera. So by the 20th century, there was also no specialized sports chronicle. Perhaps the first attempt at a specialized wrestling chronicle would be the newspaper Nueva Era, starting in 1911, with Enrique Ugartechea, who specifically talked about wrestling events, mentioned wrestlers by name, talked about weights, talked about the professional wrestling rules, and several other things that no other newspaper touched. Unfortunately, that newspaper was destroyed during the Decena Tragica, was burned, they threw dynamite at the presses, and a tradition disappeared that could only be resumed 20 years later with the emergence of the newspaper La Afición. But from there, what I mentioned continued, that aesthetic disdain from the elites, and for the same reason there was always a divorce between the public and the media. Say there was no dialogue between the makers of wrestling and the fans. This changed with the specialized magazines that began to emerge little by little starting in the 1950s, or we could even say before, with magazines like El Ring. It's the Mexican version of El Ring already existed, but they covered boxing more. Then with the magazine Lucha Libre in the 50s, the journalistic genre focused on wrestling began to grow. And I don't know if you remember all those types of magazines that existed in the 60s, 70s. Maybe you still came across some as old magazines.
In this context, Nesto, at what point does television start covering wrestling? Because we talked about the beginning of the print field, mainly with newspapers. At what point does television start broadcasting and covering wrestling in Mexico?
When did television start? Wrestling started being broadcast on television in Mexico in 1952, but as we know, the season didn't last long because it was banned due to a presidential decree. It wasn't because some people think it was Regent Churto who banned it, which isn't possible because it's not within his legal powers to do that. Simply because the Parents Association said it was very dangerous because kids wanted to imitate the wrestlers. And then they suggested to the president through a letter that they be banned, urging Televicentro to stop broadcasting those matches. For many years, there was only wrestling on television in the provinces, later on cable.
But at what point did the subject of communication, the Lucha Libre cinema, mean to make it more of a mass sport? Possibly, maybe in the cinema it wasn't seen. Was the golden era when the films of Santo and other wrestlers came out? Around what dates was this, more or less, and how significant was it?
Honestly, when wrestling starts on television, wrestler movies also begin, although some movies had already been made since the 1930s. but the most anticipated was El Enmascarado de Plata, which was made with El Médico Asesino because Santo didn't want to participate. Or it's also important to note that by then, the golden age of Mexican cinema was ending. Most of the wrestler movies are of very low quality. Movies themselves aren't much of what we were talking about in terms of media. It's more about the magazines, the way of covering wrestling.
The magazines that had the greatest impact, the ones you can best remember. Right now, as you were saying, that some of them were part of our generation, those of us in our 40s, whether as a collection, well, you always have a reference, for example. El Halcón, how much influence did El Halcón have?
Well, in those times, if you wanted to know what was going to happen in the arenas, you had to buy a magazine, whether it was El Halcón, Lucha Libre, Combates, and they all had an influence because they were also informative bulletins of the promotions. They even received subsidies in the case of El Halcón, money from Promociones Mora. That's why they promoted imported posters. I don't know which ones you remember. I suppose that before, when you started being a fan, you also found old magazines.
The main one, the one of Lucha Libre, the one I remember the most, Combat Senior, but the one with the most old copies you found therein. The one that arrived the most, Durango, was where I live. And then also the Halcon.
Which version of Lucha Libre did you get?
Very big, a relatively small magazine. I remember a lot of a cover with El Chicano Power. It's the one I remember the most, that the cover of El Chicano Power mattered a lot to me. I remember well the mask of the guy who was on that cover. It was green with red. And the main article was about El Chicano's power pack armed swords like him. And as you say, it was a magazine more focused on character. But it's more like infomercials. I was unaware of what you're commenting right now. They did have little content in that edition, at least that I remember, of the coverage of some functions, and rather it was the presentation of wrestlers, or as I say, this one of Chicano Power, that the cover was the Diet of El Chicano, also the Super Luchas one. That was with Leopoldo Meraz. If I don't remember the ones I saw, the first ones, I think the director was Leopoldo Meraz.
We're talking more or less 91 Super Luchas. It was an extension. Well, the second part of what was Espectacular, which was also a magazine that marked an era, directed by Leopoldo Meraz, which was originally going to be a photo novel. They decided to make a magazine because apart from Leopoldo Meraz, they had Fernando Gomez Arias and Antonio Cuellar, the founders of Boxilucha. With them, a new concept was created with a greater emphasis on photography.
By the way, you were just mentioning Boxilucha, I don't know, also one of the oldest. When I saw it, I'll be honest, as a kid, it didn't catch my attention because seeing a blue magazine seemed to me, since there were already color ones, most of the magazines I saw or anything, the blue magazine seemed very old to me because it was a magazine with blue pages. It was cheaper. It was more. I mean, it changed over the years. But what was the origin of the magazine being blue?
What was the decision that made it blue? I don't know. I suppose it was a matter of prices. A few years before it became blue, it was orange, the Orange magazine, like when Leopoldo Meraz was still around. Antonio Cuellar, that mouse, was still doing his column Te das en Boxilucha. In those years, it suddenly started being blue.
These magazines also served Ernesto to create characters. More than anything, we all know Mil Máscaras, Encon himself. At what point was it determined, or why was it so common? Was it because it was the only means of communication that these magazines became like the triggers for new characters? Was it an idea from the promoters themselves, or was it like a kind of synergy between the magazines and the producers?
That last thing you mentioned is a synergy because there was a huge crisis in communication between promoters and fans. The magazine served for everything, not just to introduce new wrestlers, but also to create new characters. Obviously, the magazine editors could make a business out of this, not in the way expected nowadays, because obviously Valente Perez wasn't charging for the rights of the characters. He was content with the credit and what it generated for him through the publicity of that character if it became successful.
Who might have generated more successful characters? This isn't like a knowledge test. Speaking frankly, who else was around?
No, Valente Perez, and no one comes close. In that sense, most editors didn't create characters. In fact, when the magazine Espectacular was about to start, as I said, it originally going to be a photo novel. Several new characters were going to be launched, but they stayed on the drawing board. Nothing was ever done with them.
At the end of the 20th century, there are few magazines left. I want to make a parenthesis. Then there was also Colossus, more in my youth. These magazines didn't last long. Why did they last so little? God, they were like very produced, backed, appearing on TV, on Televisa. They had great covers, artists. Why did they last so?
I would say it's because they are magazines that emerged during the wrestling boom on television in the early 90s. Many times they hired journalists. It was very noticeable, the lack of knowledge on the subject. And here a very big paradox was created because sometimes the opposite happens nowadays. There is a very big lack of preparation, but there is knowledge of wrestling that comes from being a fan. That's a somewhat thorny, somewhat controversial thought. Continuing with the magazines, what you asked, yes, mainly it was that, new fans initially accepted those magazines, but as the boom cooled down, wasn't the same interest in them. There was no reason to keep buying them.
This era ends later as we approach the final part. 20th century, early 21st century, there are 3 magazines that set the Luchas 2000, Boxy Lucha, which continued to exist. Your Super Luchas already when you assumed the editorial direction, and Luchas 2000, was it like during your time as editorial director? The battle or the fight, so to speak.
Something very curious that happened at the end of the 90s with these magazines is there were many people who were also within the wrestling scene and sometimes felt they were inside the locker rooms. We can find certain parallels with what happens currently with Facebook. Yes, I didn't like much that there was that lack of sensitivity towards wrestling as a sport, putting in hints that only certain people could understand. That's what I would say really distorted it a lot in the last years of the first stage of Super Lucas. In a certain way, that also happened in Boxy Lucha, but to a much lesser extent.
What I remember most was when the exodus from Promo Azteca from AAA happened. There was a war of columnists using pseudonyms. I never knew who they were because one would sign as Nicolas Machiavelli and then another as Gil. And then they would kind of take shots at each other in their columns, using things that one didn't really understand. But suddenly in one of those signed columns, they talked about how it's not that Tonio isn't Automoto. Tonio is losing control because, as always, he drinks too much, blah, blah, blah. Like many indirect comments, as you say, among columnists using pseudonyms. And it really seemed like a war between companies. But as you say, among people who didn't fully understand everything, you were trying to navigate some situations without being a gossip. I was into American wrestling back then, and I saw your column in Super Luchas. I don't remember who was the director when you were a columnist for Zona International. The other columns were very much about this, the fight between companies, and I felt it more between CMLL and AAA.
At the time, the director was Guillermo Magnon. After Leopoldo Megas left, Cesar Racine took charge, who had experience in magazines like TV y Novelas. After that, Antonio Peña convinced the publisher to let him take over, but he was never really the director. That position was covered by Rivera and later Magnon, although Antonio Peña continued to appear until they broke relations with him and the magazine was somewhat cleaned of the little trust there was from the CMLL towards Super Luchas. But what remained, let's say, that toxicity that had arrived with Arturo Rivera initially. And yes, there were several columnists like that. Chiavelli, I think, was Ricardo Rojas. And there were other people from the wrestling world who wrote under pseudonyms to attack each other. As I said, these were things that maybe only they understood. They would publish attacks, and the fans were left wondering what this was about. What are they talking about? Why are they writing this? I repeat, it wasn't a very nice time in that regard because one couldn't focus on the true information due to these kinds of disputes that nobody was aware of.
Yes. No, I remember that the columnists used to cross us up, as they say in wrestling terms, in the matter of Lucha 2000. I think it was the last magazine that started organizing wrestling events in Zacatlan de las Manzanas. I remember a lot. I don't know if you were in Luchas 2000 or if it had already happened, but the director Emiliano Cruz, if I remember correctly, I think it was the last publication that influenced the development of this type of characters and organizing events, but I think in the end it was not successful.
Well, he did organize some events in Zacatlan. I was still there. In fact, even held an event against ex-law in Tulansin. There were 2 events. The first one was organized by them and the second one was organized by me. But there was still another character created by the magazine who was El Testigo. Everything in Super Luchas, it was Kid Dynamo, and it was Super Astro with a mask. El Testigo, a true romantic of the magazines from the 70s, so he did everything Hector Valera would have done to convince readers that Kid Dynamo wasn't Super Astro, even taking photos of them together like Clark Kent and Superman. Unfortunately, Kid Dynamo didn't catch on because by then, What set the pace in wrestling was television, magazines, and magazines were gradually becoming outdated. They no longer had the weight they once had decades before.
Yes, I remember he also created another character that was Phoenix. The end, the guy has it now, but it was a character created with testigos. I don't know if he debuted him back then or if he just sketched him out in his columns.
I don't remember because he did talk about several. Also, someone who did that was El Arbitro, Rafael Oliveira. This whole story of the sacred. Originally, I had Antonio Peña. With him, it didn't work. I did matches where Cain defended the so-called Cinturon Arbitro against Ray Cuervo, super crazies. Yes, El Arbitro had very good ideas, I repeat, but by then those kinds of ideas no longer had the same impact they had.
Even when I saw them, it wasn't clear to me.
That's what they were, students and teachers. Antonio Peña, when he was starting out, worked with El Arbitro at the Texcoco race. He learned many ideas from him. Many thought that Antonio Peña copied Martin Karadagian's ideas to WWE. He took the ideas to create characters and give them a background from El Arbitro. El Arbitro was very imaginative, so he could have a character that was a demon, a skeleton, anything, and create a whole story. That's where Antonio Peña learned. That's why when he arrived at Arena Mexico as head of public relations, what he actually did was become the de facto creative head. I mean, he wasn't officially named that, but that's what he dedicated himself to. That's why he created characters like Máscara Sagrada, whose name is, originally it was Magico. The name itself was created by El Arbitro. Officially, a contest was held to choose the name, but that's not true. The name was already chosen when the Magico of Monterrey complained to them. So he said, let's give it another name and Máscara Sagrada. But they said, let's hold a contest to make it look like, to give the story more interest.
It's well known on social media that the person who won that contest was Tonya's right-hand man, Jesus somebody, I don't remember. We called the other one, the name was the one who had the name, according to this famous Salvador.
Yes, the same characters like Octagon, who was basically a reinterpretation of Kato Kungli, taking advantage of the boom in ninja movies that was dwindling more and more. That boom was really fading, but it was a huge hit despite not having martial arts skills like Kato Kun had in his time. Let's say Kato with leaves, it was a phenomenon in its time.
To wrap up the topic of media, the era of magazines was almost over, and alongside the magazine, the famous forums emerged. They later became the next way to communicate after web pages, and now we have it on social media. How about that? This has been for the better, the evolution from print journalism to this digital journalism that gradually replaced magazines since the early 21st century.
Well, as I said, it's paradoxical that for wrestling journalism to don't need to be someone so specialized or have so many academic credentials, because I know that from experience for people in Super Luchas who had them, journalism studies, or looking for people who were fans of wrestling, the latter always turned out better. What I could say is missing nowadays with current media is the figure of the editor, because it's something that's been lost. Well, that's been lost even in the pages of famous newspapers. They ask a lot if they don't even know what it's for, but it's the one that gives meaning to what the collaborators do. That would be good to bring back so that each medium could have an identity beyond the individualism among the young people currently covering wrestling shows.
Fans, what's the topic nowadays for those who are here watching us? You can give your opinion in the comments. More and more people are giving their opinions about wrestling. But sometimes, when it bothers me a little more, the topic of opinion, not the part where they say if so and so is good or bad, or that the bloodline, Hollywood is still just an opinion. It can take the opinion, but it's not the same as considering, I'll be honest, the opinion of Ernesto Ocampo on a subject and the opinion of Pedro Perez, a fan of 17, 18, 19, or 50 years old, who is simply just giving his opinion. I think you weigh it. What I don't like about these new media is when they give not news, information, exclusives, or analyze things like, did you know so-and-so got fired in the locker room? Because inside the other day, did you know why so-and-so got fired from WWE? He said as if they had been there inside, if they had been there with them to make decisions, like every time there's going to be a wrestling function, so-and-so is going to lose because it's what benefits the company. Stop. Do you know what's good for him? When they already assume themselves far from opinion in the kind of little knots of what happens behind the scenes, because that's where we're suffering. Something I prefer not to have worked out.
Yes, this is part of the same thing, what I said about the figure of the editor, and not so much because of that figure, rather the lack of it. The truth is that we can't be as extreme as some wrestlers who say you can't write about wrestling without having a case. If there's something missing in today's media, that there really should be media. Right now, it's not the same as just having a website, calling it Three Falls, to cover wrestling, and suddenly you're a media outlet. That specialization is needing at least a mentor, someone who is paving the way, who explains why you have to say this, why not.
But Ernesto, with this generation of content, I mean, I remember that I also learned in Lucha Libre for Ti by Jose Miguel Gomez Poncheto, which was one of the first internet pages in Mexico, that I remember, at least I to some extent, that wasn't creative, all caught up in and has been very consistent in content production. Now that everyone and isn't born on YouTube, on TikTok, Twitter, you take this medium and this platform, sometimes Ernesto, those are the ones with the most views and likes, gradually generating misinformation, because there are. Specialized ones get 20 views, but the one who says they're going to reveal the truth about why someone was fired that year from such and such company, even if it's not true, gets 2 million views. And as for self-regulation, the consumer, well, we're not there yet. Leave it to free will. Well, yes, but
there's always a way to tell the narrative of wrestling from another point of view. This is not like tabloid gossip. It's not like TV notice. This should go further because wrestling has a greater depth than other kinds of shows. It has a very rich history story that hasn't been fully told, a story that's full of myths. Breaking it can be much more interesting than this type of content that really leads nowhere.